What is going on with tipping culture, especially with rideshare drivers, Uber drivers, Lyft drivers, and more? Welcome back to Buckle Living, a channel all about making money. This is going to be a very fireside chat style video, as tipping has just gotten very interesting throughout the years. In numerous different ways, we all know tipping culture, I think if anything, has gotten weirder, I think for lack of a better word. But the weirdest industry that encounters the tipping culture in the most odd and bizarre way, 100% is rideshare drivers, the ride-sharing industry, Uber, Lyft, and more. And in this video, I really want to talk about it because yesterday, and in a couple of videos previously, I talked about a few different articles that came out talking about the way people perceive tipping when rideshare driving. And to sum that up, which is very interesting, one, a lot of people think the average tip for an Uber driver and a Lyft driver is between 6 to 10%. When they did a huge survey, they found that for most people, they thought that was an adequate tip. The weird thing, though, is if you look at any bartending gig where, like, say you are getting a drink at a bar, or like, say if you're working as a bartender, if you're tipping your waiter or your waitress, the average is between 15 and 20%. So one, why is rideshare driving and rideshare drivers be considered a less typical profession, right? Kind of weird. The second thing is a lot of people say, which is very interesting, well, they don't know where that tip is going. They don't know where that tip is going to result in and everything. And so that is also another odd, peculiar thing when it comes to Uber and Lyft, right? So I don't want to tackle all this in three. Lastly, why are drivers not getting tipped the way they should be? Now, first off, let's start with going to tackle the interesting question when it comes to tipping of what's going on with that 6 to 10%. Let's start there because that is very, very interesting to me. Now, I will say it's odd because when I first started driving, I mentioned this in a bunch of other videos, I'm going to say this super quickly because most of my subscribers know what I'm about to say. Basically, when I first started driving, you didn't tip an Uber driver and a Lyft driver. The main reason why is Uber and Lyft, it wasn't actually about any kind of weird thing with tipping, as more as they wanted to be a cashless transaction. I don't know if a lot of people remember this, but back when Uber and Lyft first came out, they said, hey, not only can you get a car right from your phone, takes 2 seconds, which is a benefit over a taxi, but a bigger thing than that they really sold hard is, hey, you don't have to have that awkward cash logistical thing take place, right? Where I have like a 50 on me and then I ask the taxi driver, can you break a 50? Or, all this kind of weird stuff of like, do you accept credit cards? Do you accept MasterCard or Visa? That kind of thing. It was a very tricky thing. And so Uber and Lyft's idea was, okay, everything happens on the app. And if you think about it, it was really one of the first industries to have everything kind of take place behind the scenes. Almost like it didn't exist. Almost like you knew you were paying for a ride. The driver knew, the Uber or Lyft driver knew they were getting money for that ride. When you almost pretended like there wasn't that awkward cash thing. And if anything, you didn't have to deal with it, right? It was kind of interesting. It was really the first industry, I think, that really kept it super behind the scenes. Like you didn't even realize what was happening. So that's the biggest reason why back in the day, they actually said not to allow tips. I remember being told this when I went through my Uber and Lyft tutorials and everything, saying, okay, if someone goes to offer you a tip, you say no. If someone goes to offer you a tip a second time, you reiterate no. If they go to offer you it a third time, you then say, okay, again, I want to stress we don't accept tips, but thank you. So back in the day, Uber and Lyft went hard to aggressively say no tips anytime whatsoever. And the main reason why wasn't because they didn't want their drivers to get tips per se, but they didn't want the awkward situation happening with tipping, with people having to, say, have cash on them, or how do you tip them, or whatever. That's what it was like back in the day. Now, I will say for me as a side note, if someone went to offer me a tip, I'd always accept it. Not because of the money, but I also think it was rude for me to refuse a tip multiple times. I thought it was kind of rude. I will say that. Now, granted, now in this day and age, I think if I look at, let's say, Gen Z, for example, I guarantee a lot of maybe Gen Zers, or maybe people now starting to take Ubers and Lyfts now, probably don't even know about that. That used to be the culture back in the day. Now it's changed a lot. So I think that's good. That's a good first step. But part of me wonders, maybe that is part of the reason why people tip only 6 to 10%. Maybe people are used to, all the people have continued to take Ubers and Lyfts for years, because I first started driving and taking Ubers and Lyfts in 2014/2015, maybe 10 years-ish later, people still use that mentality, and they're like, oh yeah, well, I guess we tip our Uber drivers, our Uber drivers and Lyft drivers now, but we didn't used to, so I'll just give them a small tip. I also wonder, what is the culture around tipping versus Uber and Lyft versus taxis? Now, my guess, I haven't seen an exact concrete evidence, there probably is it somewhere, that people tip taxis more than Uber and Lyft drivers. I think there's a few different reasons for this, right? And that's something I will talk about in this video, but it is just bizarre that people tend to view the tipping culture around Uber drivers and Lyft drivers as the lowest level of tipping, even if they do tip, right? Which leads me into the next point, and this is another one that's very interesting as to why people really don't tip their drivers. Now, I do have a couple different theories. I think a big thing of this is the GUI. I've talked about this before in other videos, the graphical user interface, where when someone completes a ride, they will have something saying like, oh, here's the rating if you want to rate your driver. Typically, most people, I feel like, either rate 1 or 5, typically 5. And then under that is this like tipping section, all that kind of stuff. And I think if they change the layout or adjusted things, I wonder if that would get better. Now, I do know there's been a couple of different approaches. I do know they've experimented with, for example, that during your ride, they say, hey, are you enjoying your ride? Give your driver a tip. That way, as opposed to asking for the tip at the end of the ride, they're asking it during the middle and at the end. I think that's a good approach. And I guarantee that one little alert on your phone that people get can equal more tips. I can't see that going in the negative way at all. I think that makes perfect sense, right? Because if you think about it, when it comes to rideshare driving, compared to, like, say, delivery driving, the kind of yin and yang counterpart, delivery driving is really the only job or instance that you tip in the beginning, not at the end. I've said this before in other videos. I know for a lot of delivery drivers, they say, okay, if I'm not getting a tip right in the beginning, I'm not going to do it. Because I don't want to do this huge drive, do all this kind of work, and not get a tip. On the other end, though, and I agree like this, I agree on this angle too, that there's been times where I've ordered Uber Eats, and it came, and it was horrible. My food was trashed. That I remember one time I said this before, I ordered a pizza, the pizza came, and it literally looked like the person folded it numerous times. Slices would almost seem like they were bent. The pizza box seemed like they went like this. Like, it almost seemed like the person said, I don't like this person, I'm gonna F their order up. That's genuinely what it looked like. I'll be honest, right? Now, granted, maybe it was for somebody else, maybe they didn't know. I don't know what happened. Maybe they took the pizza and threw it in, like, the back of their car. But, like, there was sauce everywhere. I'm talking everywhere, all over this pizza. And I tipped them like 25 or 30%. So I gave them a very high, I gave them a higher tip. And after that, I regretted tipping them, right? So I will say that being honest, to make things transparent. Bringing this back to rideshare driving, right? It is interesting, I will say that, one, even though there is a tipping feature during the ride and at the end, people still don't tip that much. I think the second biggest thing, and I've said this before in a bunch of videos, is the lack of social pressure. I'm not saying this is good or bad, per se. You could look at it from different angles. But I think the social pressure of tipping is what makes people tip, right? Because when it comes to the restaurant, and I've seen this happen, this even happened to me, let's say if one of my friends didn't do the math right, for example. Well, let's say you go to a restaurant. Typically, it's 15 to 20%. And I've seen this happen. I remember this happened to one of my friends where we went to a restaurant, we paid, they did the math out, and they weren't good at math, but they were getting the tip. And I'm like, all right. And they tipped, I think it was like 13 to 14%. So, pretty low tip. It wasn't a horrible tip, but 13 to 14% is not good. Let's be honest, right? It wasn't the worst tip in the world, but it wasn't the full 15%. And I remember the person, or one of the waiters or waitresses went up to them and said, hey, we just saw that you tipped us 13%. And they kind of did this in a very, I'm not gonna lie, I didn't think this was classy. You could argue this on this video. But they did it in kind of a slightly manipulative way. They said, okay, we noticed that typically most people tip 15%. You tipped us 13%. We did the math out. We're just curious, why did you not tip us the extra 2%? What did we do wrong so that next time in the future we can improve so that we do get a 15% tip from other people? I actually thought that was a very manipulative line. I think that both were in the wrong in some ways, where I think my friend should have been better at the math. And then for them, I feel like confronting somebody and saying something like that's a bit of a quasi-manipulative line, I genuinely don't think is like the best approach, at least in my opinion. People may disagree with me on this. Again, I'm a former rideshare driver. I used to drive for Lyft and Uber. I'm also a former bartender as well. And if I got a 13% tip, I'd be like, oh, that sucks. And I just move on. I wouldn't confront them to use this quasi-manipulative line. But anyway, right, so there is that social pressure where you might get confronted by the waiter waitress. You know, if you go to a bar and you don't tip, there may be some weird backlash. Like the bartender might look at you and be like, wait, did you just zero me? And zero is kind of like a slang term some bartenders use when they don't tip you at all, right? Some people are like, oh, I just got a beer. I'm not going to tip them, right? So there is a social pressure. And then with every other industry, when it comes to tipping, except rideshare driving. And I think it's the kind of unfortunate aspect of the logistics. That one, in a taxi, the second you leave that taxi, there's really no way for you to interact with that taxi again. It's kind of bittersweet if you look at it. Like, say, if you leave your phone in the taxi or whatever. But as a result of that, you kind of have to tip before you leave the taxi. So the driver turns around. They say, okay, there's like the device. If you have cash, I have cash on me. Or you can insert your credit card. Well, if you hit zero on a tip, the taxi driver might give you some backlash, right? So there is that social pressure. With Uber and Lyft One, everything's kind of done remotely through the app. Like I said in the beginning of this video, they discouraged tipping because they wanted it to be a cashless transaction where there wasn't that awkward situation. But it's that kind of awkward situation that generates more tips. And I know that sounds maybe an odd way to word that, but it is unfortunate for a lot of the drivers out there who are great drivers who do really, really well, and they just don't get tips. I think another thing, like I said, is maybe it's just the culture, right? Maybe it's the fact that people are just used to not tipping. But I do think it's a social pressure from the fact that when you leave out Lyft and Uber, you kind of have to tip. You could tip anytime you want, but I think to make it better, it would be better if, like, say, there's a way to make it like a radius. Where, like, hey, just so you know, I mean, again, this is a cat and not a cat and mouse, but like a chicken before the egg situation. I'm like, maybe there's a radius, but what I mean is, you can leave that Uber and tip them the next day, which is awesome. But at the same time, I think the fact that you can tip them anytime you want after the ride means most people will either A, be like, I'm going to leave, I'm not going to tip them. Why spend more money? Or B, not in even a bad way, they might forget about it. They might be like, oh, thank you so much for the ride. And go straight to the bar, the nightclub, their friend's place, wherever they're going, and their mind's rattled. They forget to tip you on the app, right? And I think that's a situation that because a tip can happen at any time after that ride has taken place, I think it leads most people to saying either A, no one's going to know, the driver's not going to know, so who cares? And B, it's also going to be like, well, I have other stuff going on, and maybe they forget, right? No, that's what I was saying. Like, I don't know if maybe you can make it like a radius clause where you can only tip them within the 5 minutes of the drive, or maybe like once the car leaves, you can tip them again. But then I'm like, no, I don't think that social pressure would exist. I don't know what the solution is, to be honest, when it comes to that. But I think the lack of social pressure is the biggest issue. I genuinely think that's the biggest issue. You know, and there's pros and cons of social pressure, right? I think one con of it, for example, and I mentioned this in other videos, they have found in studies, this is probably no surprise to anybody, that people are now tipping on things that they typically wouldn't tip for as a result of that tablet swing. That they, in any situation, you know, most people will say, hey, thanks for paying for this, whatever, the blah, blah, blah. It's just going to ask you a few questions. And they turn that tablet around, and you're like, you already know what's coming, right? I've seen even like memes about this, that you go to pay for rent and your landlord says, hey, by the way, it's going to ask you a few questions. You're like, wait, I'm tipping my landlord? I've seen a bunch of memes and jokes and like stuff online about this. We probably all have as well. And it has been getting worse. I think tipping culture is beginning a little too ridiculous, right? For sure, too ridiculous. But they found in studies that because of that social pressure, people are more likely to tip on things they would not typically tip for. So there is a pros and cons to, I think, the social pressure, but I think it's rideshare drivers who get hurt the worst. You know, that people are just not used to doing it. They know that they don't even get a slap on the wrist, that they can leave that Uber or Lyft, and it is customary as well to tip after the ride. So it's like, what is the solution? I genuinely don't know. But at the end of the day, and we can all agree this, drivers deserve more tips, right? With the low-paying culture or economy right now when it comes to Uber and Lyft drivers, like I've said in other videos, drivers get paid the least amount now, and also they have to incur all these expenses. In addition, Uber and Lyft's taking a bigger cut out of their earnings than ever before. Drivers need those tips. And remember, in case you didn't know, drivers keep 100% of their earnings. So a lot needs to change when it comes to this, I think, is the biggest thing. What the solution is, I genuinely don't know. I've thought a lot about this, honestly, and I don't know what the solution is because it's weird that out of any industry, Uber and Lyft is, I consider it a essential industry. I consider Uber drivers and Lyft drivers essential workers. That when the pandemic happened, there were a lot of people that had to take Ubers and Lyfts, whether you wanted to or not, because obviously I know a lot of people didn't want to be around other people and social distancing and blah, blah, blah. I mean, we remember all these weird things like having plexiglass. I actually reviewed it. One of my first videos on this channel, if you organize on YouTube by oldest videos, was like something called Ride Shield that was like a plexiglass type material to protect the driver and the passenger. You had to drive with the windows rolled down. Nobody could sit shotgun or up front. There were all these different rules, but you needed drivers because people need to get to and from their location, right? It wasn't just about, oh, I want to go and get drunk, because obviously no bars were open. It was about people need to get to work. Like, there's a lot of things, and I consider Uber drivers and Lyft drivers essential workers, so it's weird that the tipping is just not there. What is the solution? Again, I genuinely don't know. And talking about a solution, like I brought up in the beginning of this video, talk about the different points I really want to address, one proposed solution that was discovered by GridWise in a survey, again, I just talked about this video yesterday, is people said that if they understood more where that tip was going, they would tip more, and they would tip. Like, if they're not tipping, they would be more likely to tip and tip more. I kind of call BS, but I'll give a more personal example. I said this yesterday. I said this in a couple other videos. To briefly explain it, went to Sound nightclub here in Los Angeles. It's a nightclub. There was an EDM event called Space Yacht. Huge fan of Space Yacht, by the way. If you're into EDM, they're like Space Yacht and Brownies and Lemonade, as a side note, are like the GOATs in LA of throwing like EDM events. Bought a ticket because it was one of those situations where it was like before 11 p.m. It was like $5 at the door. Great, no problem. $5, can't beat that. Went to pay $5 with my credit card, and the lady said, "Okay, it's just gonna ask you a couple questions." She flipped that tablet around, and I was like, "What? I'm tipping to go to a nightclub?" And I was confused. And I, be honest, genuinely felt confused. I'm like, okay, is this going to the cashier lady? Is it going to the bouncers? Is it going to the nightclub itself? Is it going to the bartenders? Is it split evenly among all the staff? Is it going to the DJs or the performers? Because I love supporting live music as well. Like, who's it going to? And as a result of my confusion, I did not tip. Because I was like, well, also, that seemed kind of ridiculous too. To tip on top of like a concert receipt seemed very bizarre, right? But it made me, it kind of was, at least for me, a very real world example where maybe, just maybe, there are some people who say, hey, when I tip Uber and Lyft, my Uber driver and Lyft driver, I don't know where that tip is going. Is it going to the driver? If so, maybe I think more people would tip if they knew that. But maybe some people don't know. Maybe some people are like, hey, I don't know if this tip's going to Uber. I'm not going to tip the company. I'm not going to tip Lyft, the company. Is it going to an employee somewhere in the company? Like, who's getting this tip? I feel mixed about this because on one end, I think both things can be true. I think that when people are more confused, let's say in this tipping situation about where it's going, I could see more people be less likely to tip. I feel the same way when it comes to a charity, especially with me being a former accountant. I remember learning in school about horror stories where someone started a charity like Joe Schmo's charity, and they later found out that 90% of the charitable donations were actually just going to Joe Schmo's pocket, and only 10% actually went to the people who actually need it. So you hear these stories all the time, and I think that's why, for a lot of people, myself included, sometimes I'm a bit wary about like where to donate, who do you donate to, where's this money actually going? Same thing with tips. And I think what's tricky is, I think, like I said, both things can be true, because on one end, I'm like, I can see that. If you generally don't know where your money is going when it comes to a tip, okay. But also, I kind of call BS, where I'm like, you're already buying an Uber and Lyft. In addition, I wonder if it's going to be a cop-out where, and also it depends on how the question was worded. I said this yesterday, when it comes to like a legal term, using a leading question, where you ask a question in such a way that gives an answer that you're kind of pushing for, where if I say, okay, you don't tip. Like, say you talk to people who don't tip Ubers or drivers, Lyft drivers, and I say, well, if you knew where that money was going, would you tip? And they're like, and they don't want to seem like a bad person. So they're like, oh, yeah, I mean, and this is all BS. They're like, oh, yeah, if I knew where my money's going, yeah, I would tip. And they're just saying that so they have an excuse as to why they don't tip. Now, that could be true. Again, going a little bit down the rabbit hole here. But I think at the end of the day, though, when it comes to tipping, especially when it comes to all this kind of culture around it, I think that the clarity maybe is the issue. It could be, again, both things could be true. However, I will say when it comes to the GUI, or the structure and the layout and the visualness of the apps, both apps clearly state your driver keeps 100% of their tips. Now, maybe apps need to be more aggressive about that. Like I said, in that Gridwise study and survey, they did find if people knew more, that they would do it. So maybe what needs to happen is, in addition to that alert that Uber and Lyft has in terms of like, hey, during the middle of your ride, you enjoying your ride? Give your driver a tip. Maybe add on something to that, saying, hey, you enjoying your ride? Give your driver a tip. Remember, drivers keep 100% of their earnings or 100% of their tips. I think that could maybe be a solution. Maybe that way people can't use that clarity excuse, but maybe they roll on to another excuse. I genuinely don't know. And I think, again, for a video like this, which is a very raw, unedited, casual fireside chat style video, it is interesting, especially from my perspective, because back in the day, like I said, you didn't really tip your driver. You were told not to. Then it became this gray area of you're not told not to, but you also, it's where the Uber and Lyft didn't really have a stance on it. They didn't say do tip your driver, but they also didn't say don't tip your driver. So move from don't tip your driver to then we're just not going to say anything. Then they implemented that GUI change of saying, hey, now you can tip your driver and drivers keep 100% of their tips. So that then changed. And then it's now moved into this kind of unique section with the pandemic that people are tipping. I found more. Now, let me know what you think in the comments for all my drivers out there, because I didn't drive during the pandemic. That I feel like I heard from people that people were tipping more in the pandemic because it's like, okay, drivers are essential workers. Now, granted, it was tricky because in some situations, people were very tight on money. But I think because of what was going on, rideshare drivers were one of the few industries, that, of course, healthcare was a very essential industry, grocery workers and everything. These essential industries were there. And people were like, okay, if I have the opportunity to tip my rideshare driver, I am going to. And it seems like in the past few years, tips have kind of fallen off and gotten worse. I've seen that a lot. It does depend on the situation, right? Like I've done videos as an interesting side note that, like, say people who drive a Tesla have reported getting significantly more tips. Could it be that maybe it's the clientele has more money because they're ordering a Tesla for the Uber Lyft? Could it just be that people walk in the Tesla and they're like, ooh, this feels nice, this is clean, this is comfort, I'm going to tip them more. But then it's kind of this odd paradox where if you're driving a Tesla, you probably need that tip less than someone driving their Honda Civic that's a bit beat up. So it is kind of that paradox, although you could argue you could rent the Tesla, so it's a whole other thing. But again, it is interesting how tipping culture's changed around Uber and Lyft throughout the years, but it seems like tipping has gone down, and it almost seems now, I hate to say it, more normalized that you don't tip your driver. And I've even had this happen where I go out with friends, we get out of the Uber or Lyft, and someone says, oh, that was a great driver. I'm like, yeah, that guy was a man. That girl was super, super nice. You talk about how great your driver was. And then someone goes, oh, by the way, do you tip them? They go, oh, yeah, Or someone will say, oh, yeah, shoot, yeah, I always forget. So I think it's so normalized now that with Uber and Lyft, it's just not that normal at all to really tip your driver, right? It's typical to forget, or it's typical just not to in general. And again, there's a bunch of reasons. It could be, like I said, the lack of social pressure. It could be the logistics. I also think the aspect of a time constraint is another big one. Like, forget the radius clause, but a time constraint. Like I just previously mentioned, if you only had 5 minutes to tip, for example, we're at a bar or restaurant. If you leave and you don't tip, you cannot tip. Same thing with a taxi. Same thing with a lot of situations. And you could add this into social pressure, but there is a time constraint. When you leave that Uber and Lyft, you could tip 3 days later, I'm pretty sure. I don't know if actually there is a cutoff, to be honest. But this is another big issue, right? So at the end of the day, what is the solution? I don't know. Like I said, one thing could be, like I said, making more clarity if that is the situation, although I do kind of call BS, but who knows? Maybe just adding in a one extra sentence saying something along the lines like, hey, reminder, drivers give 100% of their tips. Maybe that alone could actually change the game and maybe get drivers more tips. Now that people are knowing, like, hey, when you do tip, it's not going to Uber, Lyft, the company, or the CEOs or whatever. It's going to the drivers, and they keep 100% of their tips. Their tips are not, we don't take a cut out of their tips or whatever. Maybe that would solve it. But also, too, how would you improve the social pressure? I know that sounds weird. I don't know. Maybe it is the case that drivers now have that tablet in the back. They say, hey, by the way, before you leave, this is just going to ask you a few questions. Maybe that would solve it, where every driver gets a tablet. I don't know. At the end of the day, like I've said in a bunch of other videos, no matter what, drivers need to get tipped more. And let me know what you think in the comments. Out of any industry, it is a fundamental fact that of any industry, the tipping culture around rideshare driving is by far the weirdest. And in some ways, I get it, I guess, based off all the logistics. But in other ways, I'm just like, I don't know why. Why do rideshare drivers really not get the tips they deserve?